because they're fascinating. Blowing up the bridges, the rivers, by the camp. There's, uh, well, just everything. I was fascinated by him. So,
It illustrates the chaos
oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
that the POWs were in the midst of.
yeah. Well, he did a before and after too, of what it looks like now in Moosburg, and then he put up what is still there in Moosburg, which I always find those fascinating. But I'll send you, Nancy, the link, individually, and then and Glenn too, if you all want to see it, and then decide if you want to post it, because I just found it this morning. I've never seen him before.
If you send it to Sean and Sean can put it in the chat as we're working on this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we're at 7. Hello to social media. We'll get the music started. We'll let everybody in. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Greatest Generation Live for Thursday, May 29th. I am Sean Hall, the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. It's great to see you all this evening. Great to be here on a beautiful day here in Pittsburgh. We have a special program lined up for you with our host, Glenn Flickinger. Glenn, how are you doing tonight?
Doing excellent. Thanks very much, Sean. Yeah, there was that funny yellow thing up in the sky today.
I saw it, which it near blinded me when I looked up and saw it.
I thought it was an alien spaceship at first.
Absolutely. It's always nice to get it here in Pittsburgh because we get it so few days. But yeah, great day here in Pittsburgh. I see some new names here in the room with us this evening. Welcome. We invite you to check out our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org, to find out everything there is to know about us. We've been around for 16 years, all centered around veteran storytelling events. These are our online events. We're online every Monday and Thursday night at 7, and we do our in-person breakfasts as well here in the Pittsburgh region and kind of in around Philadelphia, a bit into Ohio. But if you haven't come to an in-person breakfast, please come check us out there. It's always a great time. It's always a great breakfast, and it's always filled with wonderful veteran stories. I had a question, though, Glenn, to kick us off in a way tonight, because, we've been doing Greatest Generation Live for about a year and a half now, but we've come back to the POW conversation multiple times. And if you had asked me a year and a half ago, like, how many programs can we get out of a POW conversation? I'd think maybe 1 or 2. But boy, there are more. There almost seems there's a whole separate encyclopedia, multiple encyclopedias of just the POW experience.
Exactly. And I think our audience has found it fascinating because, the numbers of views we've had on the programs we posted, it all starts with the quality of the people we're able to put on. And tonight we have 2 of our great friends of the Veterans Breakfast Club and 2 incredibly knowledgeable women on POW camps, specifically the Air Force POW camps, okay, not all prisoners of war camps. When that's what we focused on last year, right, was the experience of the U.S. Army Air Force POWs. All right. That's a good point. Maybe we ought to think about developing a couple of programs on the other POWs that were taken, because there were a lot of just U.S. Army POWs taken in North Africa and then Italy and then throughout the campaign. But we've never really focused on them. And then we've bounced back and we've talked about Italian POWs in the U.S., German POWs in the U.S. So yeah, it's like you say, it's sort of its own subject that a lot of people like. So let's get started tonight. We have, again, 2 of our very good friends on tonight that were on half a dozen or more times last year. Marilyn Walton, give us a good hello there. Marilyn Walton introduced us to so many other people last year whose father was in a POW camp, who experienced different terrible things, concentration camps, etc. Marilyn was the historical consultant to Masters of the Air series on the POW camps. So her knowledge is deep and she's been very, very generous in sharing it with us. So tonight we're going to focus on her and Nancy Putnam. Nancy, say hello, please.
Hello.
All right. And Nancy, also another walking encyclopedia of knowledge on the U.S. Army Air Force, and specifically more so on the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, that we did so many programs on last year, that the Masters of the Air, video series focused on as well. And Nancy is the editor of their magazine, been involved with the foundation there forever and a day, I would guess. And Nancy, we're really happy to have you on. So specifically tonight, we're not really getting into sort of the POW experience, except through the stories of these two women's fathers. And that's what started their interest in POWs, is that both of their fathers were U.S. Army Air Force, both shot down in 1944, I think both in 44, different months. Both became POWs, but at different camps. Marilyn's at Stalag 3, which was featured in the Masters of the Air program last year, and Nancy's at Stalag 1, which was not featured, Nancy, unfortunately. And it's interesting. I've had the real honor of talking with these two women for the past couple of weeks, going into the story and developing this slide deck you're going to see in a little bit. And it's interesting. I learned just how different the two experiences were.
Right.
And we're going to try to get to the story of the liberation of the camps. We would have liked to have done this program, on the actual 80th anniversary back a couple months ago, but it just couldn't work out timing wise and schedule wise for everybody. So we're doing it, 80th anniversary plus 6 or 7 weeks from that date. Okay, so let's get started, and we'll pause as often as we can for questions. And let me pull up my proverbial PowerPoint, which
while you're pulling that up, Glenn, I wanted to make mention that George Rubin is in the room.
Oh, George. Is he unmuted?
Let me ask George to unmute. George is one of our World War II veterans.
Oh, great.
And a prisoner of war. And was at Moosburg.
There you go, George.
Yeah, good to be with you.
George, what a privilege to have you on. Unexpected. Thank you so very much for tuning in. You're obviously getting our emails.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We're going to be talking about the liberation of two prisoner of war camps tonight. Stalag 1, where Nancy's father's was, and Moosburg 7A, where Marilyn's was. And you were at Moosburg, as I recall.
Yeah, I was Moosburg 7A, and I was in Newburgh and 13A at Nuremberg, 13B, 2 camps, yeah.
Well, we're going to ask you now and then to make some comments, I'm sure, as the program goes on. There's nothing like getting it from a person who was there. Okay. So the title is a little broader than the reality. It's not the liberation of all POW camps. We're really going to focus, if I can make this thing advance, on Stalag 1 and Stalag 3. Okay. So we pulled up this map just to start the discussion, and it shows you the location of the various Stalag camps. Not all the POW camps, not all the concentration camps or anything. This just focuses on the Stalag Luft camps. And Nancy, your father was up here in Stalag Luft 1, near, what was the name of the city? Barth. Barth. Okay.
The Germans pronounce it Bart. We pronounce it Barth.
Bart. Okay. And then not too far away, 90, 100 miles,
90.
Marilyn's father was at the famous Stalag Luft 3, famous because that was also the site of the Great Escape. Do I have that right, Nancy? I mean, sorry, Marilyn.
Yes. Yes. It's That was very famous for the Great Escape.
Yeah. And remind us, Marilyn, what was Dulag? Why do we have that with such a big star here? What happened?
Uh, you have that because all of the downed airmen, whether officers or enlisted, were interrogated at Stalag Luft, and that was near Frankfurt in the town of Oberrussel. And from there, the crews got split up, enlisted and officers. The officers went to 1 or 3. The enlisted men usually went to Stalag Luft 4 or 6,
Yeah.
those are on the map as well. So that's where it all started out. After interrogation, then they went to their permanent camps.
And the geography is important relative to what happens at the end of the war, which is why we want you to keep this map in mind and why I'm going to show it again a little bit later. Okay. So let's start with this very handsome young man.
Yes, I know him well.
Tell us about him.
That is my father, again, with the 458th Bomb Group. He was shot down on his 3rd mission, shot down June 18th, as it says here. The target was Moosburg, Germany, but the plane got as far as, and I know you have a picture of the plane, which was an old war-weary with far too many engine hours on it. There it is, Rhapsody in Junk. It was not that crew's plane, their plane. They kind of inherited it for that mission, which was really too bad. And originally they were scheduled to fly on June 17th, but his roommates, there was another crew, real good friends of him. They roomed with him in England. At the last minute, the crews switched flights and missions, and that crew was actually shot down there on the 17th, and their plane was blown out of the sky, and only one survived, and he was very badly injured. The next day, my father was shot down with his crew. They got as far as Hamburg, where you didn't want to be shot down at that time of the war by any means, because it had been leveled so many times that when crews went down there, many were hanged from the lamppost there. So everybody wanted to get past Hamburg for sure. And they limped along till they got another really bad place, Kiel, where the subpens were, which was heavily defended. They had smoke pots to hide, and there were so many guns in that area. And he said when they flew over that, it sounded like the 4th of July, and they were down to 1 engine at that point. Wow. So they all bailed out. 9 survived, 1 was dead on the ground.
And I'm sure our viewers will recognize this is a B-24, not the
B-24
B-17 that Nancy's father was in. And just sort of glancing at it, it's aptly named. I mean, it does look like
it was. My father always said it was aptly named. They flew over in a silver plane called Miss Pat. It was great. That was taken away from them, and the day they flew their 3rd mission, they got this thing.
Okay. Now let's move on to another handsome young man, Captain Gerald R. Putnam. Nancy, tell us about your father.
My dad flew with the 100th Bomb Group, arrived in the fall of 43, shot down on his 21st mission on March 3rd, 44, by which time he had been promoted to operations, and he was a command pilot. So he was only flying every 4th or 5th mission. And when he did, he was leading the 13th Combat Wing, or at least the group, but sometimes the 13th Combat Wing. And on March 3rd, he was leading the wing. So he was out in front. There was a recall. The lead planes did not all hear it. The planes behind did. They managed to turn around and go back. Weather had gotten awful. When the 3 lead planes broke out of the clouds, they were jumped by some 190s, fought with 190s, and all 3 lead planes were shot down. Dad ended up at Stalag Luft, as Marilyn was just describing, and was then transported up to Stalag Luft 1 and arrived just as the Great Escape was happening at Stalag Luft 3.
Right. Okay. So let's now talk just a little bit about each of these 2 stalags, okay? And again, I want to show you the location. This is a very weak attempt at identifying it. Weak because the actual name wouldn't copy over what I had, so I put a little red mark there where about Stalag Luft 3 was near. What was the name of the town it was near, Marilyn?
Uh, s- um, Stalag Luft 3 was fairly close to Berlin, but it was
Berlin.
in Sagan, Sagan, Germany, which we always have to keep making that distinction because people say it was in Poland. Well, it's in Poland now because of war reparations. Poland got that part of Germany where the camp was, but at the time it was in Sagan,
Yeah.
Sagan, Germany.
Hard to talk about Stalag Luft 3 without bringing up this man who
Right.
was a character, but not a featured character in Masters of the Air. And the more I learned about him, the more I was fascinated about it. I got the book and I read the book that you recommended,
Mhm.
Nancy. Tell us about Lieutenant Colonel A.P. Clark.
Oh,
Yeah.
uh, right. He was shot down on his first mission. He flew with the Canadians. He got into the war very early, and the group he flew with, they flew Spitfires. So he went down in a Spitfire unfortunately on his first mission. He was the first American fighter pilot that was shot down in the ETO. He has that distinction. And he became a real leader of men in the camp. He was at first in North Compound, where Roger Bushell had appointed him to oversee security on Tunnel Harry, and he had about 600 men under him that he supervised for that. And then, of course, he didn't go out through the tunnel because they were all transferred to South Compound later. Yeah, and you can see on this map where Harry was. And we should mention that this map confuses a lot of people because you see a huge prisoner of war camp here on the left. That was a French camp that was built before Stalag Luft 3. And it was a labor camp. And it was just a budding where you can see that the West Compound, if you look just to the left of that big camp, you see a long road there. That's West Compound. In the night of the march, all the men went down that road. They turned left on the main road, and that started the march out of the camp. They all went that way.
Just a couple other shots.
Very stark.
Yeah, very stark, every camp looked more or less like this. Some
Hmm.
is, but they were rubber stamped out into the countryside. Uh, not much to do, as we talked about many times last year in the various programs.
Boredom. Yeah.
Yeah, and just another drawing of the north compound of Luft 3. And again, you can see Tom, Dick, and Harry. But the only tunnel remaining, if you go there to see it, Marilyn, I think you told me is George. You can
Well,
actually.
George, most people don't know too much about George. That was the last tunnel built. There were actually 100 tunnels built in this camp over the time the men were there, and very few successful, of course. But George was used towards the end of the war to store any weapons that the men were able to crudely make, anything of value, records, artwork, they all stored in Tunnel George in case the Russians came in or the Germans turned on them there. They they had planned, and it was seen in Masters of the Air, how uh, General Clark, well, he was Lieutenant Colonel then, had told Jerry Sage, who was with the OSS, to train them to fight the guards in camp if they had to. And that's where they would go to Tunnel George to whatever crude things that they had there to work with.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
And then it's hard to talk again about Luft 3 without talking about
yes.
at least two or three of the German players, if you will. Who are these people?
That is the Commandant, Colonel von Lindiner, and with him is a German censor in the camp named Lisa Knuppel, and she was also his secretary and became very close with his family. And she is the real Helga from Hogan's Heroes. If you watched that and saw Helga, she is the real Helga at that point.
And
Um,
we had her daughter on last year,
Yeah, yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah, you did. Yeah. And she has a fascinating story that would make a movie. Her story alone, and I've written it up for one of the books Mike Eberhardt and I did. Um, and she became very close to the family. And one interesting thing, she used to go out to their villa And once when she was out there, she saw a man come in, a German soldier with his arm was in a sling. And the two of them, von Lindiner, took the man in another room, not wanting the conversation to be heard. And it turns out it was von Stauffenberg. And
Oh,
yeah, and she realized it when she saw his pictures later. So he had
wow.
been telling von Lindiner about the possible assassination they were planning of Hitler.
Did he look a lot like Tom Cruise?
She never said. I don't know. I'm not sure. But the other
Great
thing,
movie. That Tom Cruise plays that character
that's
in
right, I know. Yeah.
Valkyrie.
The other thing she did was help the von Lindiner family after the Great Escape because she had to get Mrs. von Lindiner away from and out away. And she helped she was a Dutch baroness and she wanted to take all her jewels with her. They lived in a beautiful villa not far from the camp. And so she and Mrs. von Lindiner hid all the jewels in a silo, or it was like a water tower, and they locked them in there so she could come back after the war and get them.
Yeah.
Nobody's been ever, it's all wooded over there now, overgrown, but nobody could ever find it. And so they think the Russians eventually got all of her things when they came in.
And the other person we want to mention is Major
Zim,
Simolev.
Zimmelite.
Zim.
He was, well, kind of like the adjutant, but he was actually the deputy commander or commandant of the camp. And it fell to him to go to Moosburg. And he is the one who you'll see later a picture of him surrendering the camp.
Yeah.
He was a very mild-mannered history professor in his civil life before the war, a very intelligent man, a fairly kind man, and he worked well with the prisoners of war. He did not go on the march he took a car and he carried all the ID cards from Stalag Luft 3 in that car and delivered them. He didn't march with the men, but he evacuated at the same time, went to the camp.
And we'll bring him back
He'll
into
be
the
back.
story at the surrender. And
Yeah, he and Clark, their lives from this period on were really, they paralleled each other. And I just found them both in everything I was looking at.
So now we move on just to set all this up about the background on Stalag Luft 1, which again, here's my weak attempt at a dot up here, where it is. Sean, I thought about sending this to you and asking you to do a professional job, but I ran out of time. But here it is, obviously right on the North Sea. Nancy must have
It's
been,
the Baltic Sea.
or Baltic Sea, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Baltic Sea. Must have been pretty harsh conditions, especially in the winter up there.
Yeah, it literally was on that little peninsula, just kind of a little bit up or right from your kind of right in there. Exactly. That's it.
Yeah.
And it was an L-shaped camp, 4 compounds. The original was called either the South or the West, sometimes Southwest. And then that, I think, Maryland, that housed mostly Brits. They got sent then to Luft 3.
Yeah, a lot of them, and the guards.
Yeah.
Some of the ones from Masters of the Air, Glemnitz was with them in 1, and he ended up in 3. And
right, and so then what became the North 1 compound, as the Americans started getting shot down, was actually permanent housing for flak training Hitler youth. So it was the best of the buildings. That's where my father ended up. They opened that up in early 1944. Meanwhile, they had brought back some of the Brits and had put more Americans in the Southwest compound. And then up the peninsula was North 1. Months later, they opened North 2. And then late 44, they opened North 3. So it became a 4 compound camp. With a series of senior Allied leaders. And I think one of the things in all our conversations and our debate about how you present these differences, I think, whereas probably partially because the Masters of the Air, that Marilyn and Glenn have focused on the German leaders and only 1 or 2 of the Americans. At Stalag Luft 1, what defines that camp are the American leaders, all fighter pilots, all aces. And it was really quite a remarkable group. And
And
the second tier of leadership were the barracks commanders in that camp. And those were mostly heavy bomber pilots and officers of, operations, command pilots like my dad.
And one of the most famous, most well-known
Is
and
Hub.
interesting characters is Hub Zemke. So
Yep.
fighter pilot, tell us about Hub.
So Hub was first generation German American, spoke German at home, grew up in rural Montana, born in 1914. So he was kind of on the old side by the time World War II came around. He had joined during the Depression because he couldn't get a job. He ended up joining the Army Air Corps as a fighter training, kind of in the fighter training program. He wasn't influenced so much as most of them were that he was thrilled with aviation or that was his goal. He needed a job and somebody recommended it to him. And of course, once he was in, he was hooked. He rapidly rose. By 1940. He is a test pilot at Wright Pat for P-40 fighters. He's really good at it. He gets sent over to England. We're still not in the war. He's training the Brits on the P-40. He then gets sent to Russia, where he learns Russian, and he spends many months, I want to say 8 or 9 months, with the Russians, training them on the P-40s during Lend-Lease. Of course, we end up getting into the war. He wants to fight the war, but you can't just go back across Europe. So he took this circuitous route through Africa and ended up going back home, gets assigned a fighter group, and the rest, as they say, is history. He leads several groups. He is the leading ace for much of the war. He ended up being tied for or in second place. Famously, the 56th Fighter Group was his, known as Zemke's Wolfpack. He then switches to another group where he gets to fly P-38s and P-51s. They finally basically ground him and say, we're giving you a desk job in October of 1944. And he says, I got to do one more mission. And of course, what happens in that mission? He has structural failure of a P-51 in a severe electrical storm, and he bails out over northern Germany. Spends 6 weeks. That's my favorite part of the story, actually. 6 weeks, he literally gets shuffled around Stalag Luft, different camps. He gets stuck on railway cars for days at a time. He gets, and Marilyn has the story as well. He ends up, for some reason, being passed over, as they don't realize who they have in the early weeks. Hans Scharf, the master interrogator, finally figures out who the heck they have. And that's when they isolate him and bring him back to Frankfurt. What they try and persuade him to do, we're talking November 1944, Germans are losing. They try and persuade him to organize an allied German fighter group to fight the Soviets. They want him to lead it. He says no. They stick him back in solitary for 2 weeks and have him reconsider. This goes round and round for several weeks. They finally give up, stick him on a train, and he ends up at Stalag Luft 1, right as the Battle of the Bulge is breaking loose. So that becomes his introduction to POW life, and he immediately becomes the senior Allied officer because he is, they said by date of rank, there are a bunch of colonels there, but he had the earliest promotion date. He comes in, there's over 9,000 POWs in the 4 compounds. And he immediately realizes that he's got the singular job, and this is really different than Luft 3 or any other camp. He realizes Germany is crumbling. He has just spent 6 weeks in the middle of it. He was strafed. He had every experience on the ground you could imagine. He realizes his singular job is to protect those POWs, get them out alive, and not force march. There were already forced marches going on even before Luft 3 in January, and he was well aware of it. Yeah. So that became his job.
And these other shots are just, a couple of shots of
Yep.
Luft One. Again, unless you're an expert like Nancy and Marilyn, you can see these shots of the different camps, and hard to know which one it is unless you're really intensely knowledgeable. Okay, so next we're going to go into the beginning of the liberation. The beginning of the liberation starts with the Great March, and it happens from Stalag Luft 3, and we're going to show you that in a second. But in the spirit of stopping for a moment or two from continuous PowerPoint slides, let's stop and see what might be addressed by questions from the audience, or Sean, anything in the chat that should be addressed.
Yeah, Colin, thanks for all of the comments here. Everybody check it out. Great chat this evening. From Bob Van Bargen, why did the B-24, this was earlier in the evening, why did the B-24 go further east to Kiel and not turn back west to the UK?
Well, they were already having engine trouble, and they didn't want to turn around and go back over Hamburg and go north. And I think that was a big part of it. And the pilot decided it would be best to, with engines that they had still working and they were starting to fail already, to try and go in the other direction. I don't know all the fine details of it, but they determined that it was not a good idea to turn around and face more flak or problems trying to get back to the UK.
And from Brad, which I believe Greg Yost found a Wikipedia article about this, but how many stalags were there? The map that we showed earlier, of course, shows several, but like how many POW camps were there in Germany?
Well, Nancy and I have both
define
seen
it.
the map. There's so many you can't name them, but there's a difference between Stalags and Stalag Lufts to make that.
Yes, so if it has LUFT in it, that's an airman's
Luftwaffe.
camp. There were lots of stalags that were for different nationalities. And some maps then also put some of the concentration camps on, which are totally different.
Right.
It's really confusing, to be perfectly honest. And I've heard, and I know I saw it pop up that somebody was quoting Wikipedia. I caution you not to go to Wikipedia. It's not. The National World War II Museum and other museums have reputable information on the camps.
I agree.
So there were, whatever it was, 5 or 6 or 7 Stalag Luft camps, but
Right.
the rest were POW camps for other types of prisoners from
Right.
different
You have the
nationalities.
two enlisted, and you have the 2 officers camps are the main Stalag Luft camps.
Right.
Right.
And then technically Stalag Luft, that was German Air
I mean,
Force as well.
the list. So I have that famous Red Cross map from late 44, and it has about 35 camps that are considered to be American prison camps holding all branches: naval, infantry, air corps. A lot of them came up from Italy when the Germans took over Italy and prisoners came north. So that's kind of why we have focused it in on what we know, which is where our fathers were held.
Yeah, because some were for
very
ground
broad
troops
subject.
too. You had ground troops, and there were
Exactly.
medical camps specifically. There were 2 where very badly injured, Lambsdorff was one,
Yes.
to go there first before they went on to their permanent
Yeah.
camps. So you're right. Nancy's right. It's
Yeah,
very
it's a very complex topic.
One that would take us 10 programs to get into, and all we're trying to do tonight is, as an example, talk about these 2, the fathers of these 2 women, and show you what happened in their camps.
Right. One thing comes to mind when Nancy mentioned Zemke and touched on Scharf, that after the war, it's really interesting to know that those ace fighter pilots from up at Barth became very good friends of his, and very good
Yes.
friends of his after the war. So
Yeah.
go figure. He loved the fighter. He was waiting for Zemke to come in. He couldn't wait, and
Oh.
Dabrowski.
So we'll come back to unless Sean, there was something else, we'll come back and start now with the Long March starting in January of 45.
One more from Bob. We showed the camp in East Prussia. He asked what happened to them when the Russians advanced and devastated that area.
If you would hold on for about 10 more slides, that we answer that question precisely. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Okay, so Marilyn,
Yes.
tell us what happens here with the Long March.
The Long March, and technically that's the British term. The Americans called it the Forced March. It goes by a lot of different names. For our purposes, it's probably the Forced March with the Americans, but January 27th, the camp was evacuated at the last minute by Hitler's order because he knew that the Russians were closing in from the east. The men had kind of sensed it was coming, but could never be prepared for what they really experienced. All of the men went out. South Compound went out first. My father was in South at 11 at night and around the clock into the next day. By the time North Compound was evacuated, the RAF went out last. There was just a steady stream out of there. The line of the total march with all the men was 20 miles long. They calculated that. It was the coldest winter in 50 years in Germany. Some of the men, not South Compound, but that road I showed you on the other map, when they went out, they picked up Red Cross parcels, but South didn't get them for some reason first, and they tamped down all the snow going out. And they marched to Spremberg. Took them a couple of days to get on the boxcars there in Spremberg at the train station. This is the ones you showed just before this slide. Those were clandestine pictures of the march. Some of the men made little sleds that they eventually abandoned because the weather warmed up and it was in slush. Some of them broke. They had wrapped all of their clothing and things. Essentially what they brought, that which they needed, divided into three parts, was the clandestine radios. And each man would have a part, and eventually they'd all put the parts together in the barns that they stayed in, whatever, and could listen to the BBC. And the Germans kind of knew that because they had a lot of news from the BBC as well, and a lot of it came through the clandestine radios. So yeah, they marched. It was a bitter march. A lot of them were frostbitten. They had German guards on either side of them who were pretty much infirm. They had fought on the Eastern Front and had been injured, and that's how they ended up being guards in prisoner war camps. And some of the guards were liked very well by the prisoners, and they showed it in Masters of the Air. That was one of the stories. They carried their Germans' rifles for them because I think just at the end, one of the German guards had a heart. They weren't in any shape to march at all. The guards had it pretty badly. So
You think Masters of the Air portrayed the march fairly, accurately?
They combined a couple of things. There were two marches. West Compound went down to Nuremberg, and they kind of combined that one, and they put Jefferson, Tuskegee Airmen on that march, which he wasn't on. The thing that, and maybe they did it for lighting reasons, there was no way they carried those big torch lights. That would never have been allowed. I had sent them a picture of a really funny German little flashlight that they carried that made a lot of noise as they had it on at night. And they did march a lot of times. They marched at night and they slept during the day, but the torches were not accurate. But they had their reasons for doing that, probably.
And they end up here at Stalag 7A. And
yeah, well, they got to Spremberg, and most of them from Spremberg on West Compound went down to Nuremberg, 13D, and the others went to Moosburg. And it was a horrendous trip on the box cars. And by that time, a lot of the men had dysentery. They had very little water on the box cars. It was a horrendous time. And then they got down there into Stalag 7A, which actually was the largest POW camp. It was built in 1939 to hold 10,000 prisoners. And as Nancy and I had discussed, the end of the war, there were 120 to 130,000 men in that camp of 72 nationalities. It was a Wehrmacht camp. People confuse that. There's no Luft in the name there. So, you know, it's a German army camp. And the conditions you can see here were absolutely filthy. This is the way they lived until April 29th, 1945, when they were liberated. And I think this watch from Masters of the Air, you might recognize that that German tower there. That's right at the front of the camp. That's eventually, we'll show the picture later, the tank went through that gate on Liberation Day. But that tower now, Masters in the Air, they showed it being shot up. It actually was not shot up. It stayed for several years because that camp was later used to house German POWs and refugees and a lot of different people. And eventually they took that down.
Let me bring George in since
Yeah, I'd like to hear.
and he was there. Does this
Yes, yeah.
look familiar to you, George?
It's interesting what you say about 7A and liberation. It was a horrible place to live. We got there late in the day, of course. I'm talking about our crew being shot down in February of 1945. So we're talking about arriving at Moosburg in April of 1945 after being in Nuremberg and Dulag and the Oberstdorf. So that we got there, the conditions were pretty horrible. Now, for liberation, the Patton's Third Army was getting quite close the end of April, and a team of men came in under a flag of truce to talk to the German commanders at Moosburg on handing over the camp to the American and Allied forces. Unfortunately, at that time, an SS contingent told the German commanders that they would not allow the Americans and they were going to fight for the camp. So when the two groups left after having these deliberations, we were told by the Allied commander, it was a General Good. I don't know where
Good. Yeah, he was
I
a
don't know
senior
where he'd
Allied.
been captain,
Yeah.
but he was quite a guy.
Good.
But he told us men, I got to tell you, there's going to be a battle here. My suggestion for you is dig a foxhole. There's nothing we can do about it except to protect ourselves. So I dug a little foxhole with two other Canadian soldiers at that time. They had been seminary students before they became soldiers. So I'm in the foxhole and they gave me sets of beads. And for the first time, to this day, I still know my Hail Marys, beginning to end. So we stayed there, and a battle did continue. Unfortunately, about 10 of the POWs were killed in this horrible thing before the Allies entered the camp. Infantry division with a tank came in, and we were told by the Allied forces, don't go out, don't do anything. Liberation has taken place. So those are the basic details. Other things went on, but those are the basic details of April 29th or 30th it was, that we were liberated by Patton's Third Army. But it was not a pleasant time.
So this is a map that we wanted to show just to illustrate where the main camp was, Moosburg down here. Nancy, any comments on George's comments? Any further explanation? How long did the battle last, Nancy?
We lasted 2 or
Be
3
from
hours,
Maryland.
Glenn.
Maryland's
longer
the-
than it should
I'm
have.
sorry,
Yeah.
Marilyn. Excuse me. Yeah. 2 or 3 hours, George is saying.
No, well, actually, before it began, they had a chance to stop that battle because Patton had actually called Zimmelite, and he said, "We want you to surrender. We'll make it easy for you. No war crimes trials. No." He made a lot of promises to them, and that George mentions the SS guy that was there. He was determined to take the camp. And I just learned recently that SS units that were there that day were very inexperienced for some reason. I don't know the full story. They weren't the cream of the crop by any means. And And so they had that try. And so Patton told Zimlite, okay, he said, we're going to attack at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And there was a second chance after that, which George mentioned with Pop Good, who was the senior Allied officer in the camp. He took over things. They met with the SS colonel you mentioned going out of the camp, and also the head of the third air, Patton's group, the Third Army. And again, they said, here's the deal, we can avoid this fight. But the SS colonel demanded, well, what he wanted was Moosburg to be declared an open city, so there'd be no fighting. And they told him, no, unconditional surrender. That's it. We're not going to do anything else. And so they said, okay, that's it. And that's when they decided that they were going to have a battle there. And most of the battle took place, if you look on this map, that's the German quarters. You can see the main camp, and you can look at the prison guard barracks down there. And I think, Glenn, we have another picture, an actual a picture of that. And a lot right here, yeah. The arrow at the bottom is the commandant's office. This is outside the gate, that main watchtower that you see. This is outside. It's not far at all. And the other are the German barracks right there. And these barracks, the SS went in and they demanded loyalty of what guards that were left. On the 29th as well, from the German High Command, they told Similite, you stay, you're the one officer with just a small detachment, and get all the other Germans guards out of the camp. They left that night, but they were all captured the next day. But the battles, the ones that did remain, lived in these German barracks right here. And when they refused to cooperate because they had a special deal with protecting power, if they would stay and guard the troops, the SS came in and just lined up 14, shot them, had 2 behind another bush, shot them in the forehead.
They shot the German guard.
German guards. And ironically, because of what they did in shooting the guards and all that, they actually, on that day of liberation, they had killed more Germans than the Americans did. They were killing their countrymen. And they had also, the SS had gone out early on the 29th with 15 minutes of training to train old men and very young boys to handle a Panzerfaust to ward off all the tanks they knew were in the area. And some refused, and they just shot them dead. All the ones that refused, they shot them as well. So it was a pretty pitiful situation going on outside that main gate as well. But the battle started here with the tanks right here.
And how many of the POWs were killed? I think George said 10. Is that what I heard?
Yeah.
I know of
Right,
one who
right.
was injured, and I have not heard of any, and not to disagree
Could be more, yeah.
with George, but I have not heard of any. It was mostly a lot of the Germans were, one tank, I know, I read one tank was stopped and there was a fatality on the one tank coming in, an American tank. I have not heard of it. I mean, from the officers I knew that were there, I couldn't speak to it, but.
So George, you're in your foxhole praying the Hail Mary to Canadian friends. If it were me, I'd have dug that foxhole all the way to China. But did you stay in that foxhole the whole 2 or 3 hours? Could you see anything from the foxhole? Understand what was going on?
No, we were just hiding from whatever conflict was taking place. But let me say, when liberation took place, the Americans came in, opened the door, the gates. There wasn't any hurrahs, and there was sort of a quiet in the camp. Most of the men had been prisoners, as Marilyn said, coming down from Stalag 3 and others for a long, long time. We were the newcomers, the youngsters there. But there was a feeling of liberation, of just being quiet. No rah-rahs. A lot of men were in very physical and medical conditions, needed help. So there was something that nobody really celebrated when you think of a celebration, just sort of a relief and it went on that whole afternoon and evening. Just men just stayed there, you know? It's very hard
George,
to describe.
yeah, when you talk about the quiet, from what I've understood from some others, that quiet came when the shooting stopped. And there was a period of time when the prisoners, when they came out of the barracks or wherever they were, they didn't see Americans, they didn't see Germans, and they didn't know what happened. You correct me if
Right.
I'm wrong. And they thought, well, maybe the guards are coming back. Maybe they're all regrouping. There's going to be a second battle. They weren't sure exactly what was going on. And an immense quiet came up over the camp at that point until they saw that the American tank come through the gate. And this, the other things that happens was what I understood. I know when the battle started, General Clark told me Pop Good came in through the camp that morning. They had fed him bacon, eggs at his little meeting he went to, the American troops, and the first eggs he'd had and bread for white bread for a while. He came back in, and about that time the battle started. And Clark, he said, everybody dig a hole and get in it. He said the war's about to start. And so all those men in the camp hit the ground at the same time so hard that Clark said you could feel it shake. I don't know if you remember that. He said you could feel the ground shake. And then the battle commenced, shortly after that. So that's what I had heard. It was interesting to compare with your notes.
Yeah. One of the more stirring elements, scenes, should say, in the Masters of the Air series was the raising of the American flag over the camp.
There
And
he
in,
is.
in the Masters of the Air series, it's dramatically raised by, I forget which character, one of the main characters, one of the pilots.
Egan.
Egan. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And
That
no, he didn't raise it, but it looked really good on the film.
it did. It did. It made me shiver watching it go up. But the reality is, this man put it up.
Yes,
What
he
do you know
did.
about him?
Martin Lane, I really think it could have been a really dramatic ending to that and elicited even more emotion the way that it really happened with him,
It
because
wasn't with the 100th Bomb Group. That's
that's
the
right.
problem.
That's right. I forgot that part, Nancy.
You got to keep with the plan.
Yeah, that was the plan. That's why he got eliminated from the series. He General Clark had smuggled an American flag in. I'm not sure where he got it. And he gave it to Elaine um, early on when they were still at Stalag Luft 3. And it was to in case the planes were flying over either camp, especially 7A, they would display the flag to indicate that that was a prisoner of war camp in case he didn't know and they needed to be liberated, that kind of thing. And so it was a pristine flag, and he sewed it between two blankets, Martin did. And he carried it, that flag went with him on the march. It went with him, they kept him warm on the march. It was on those horrid boxcars when they were all so sick. It went through all his experiences until he got to the camp. And when the shooting stopped and they knew that they were being liberated, Clark sent him to get the flag. Now, the difference between the Masters of the Air flag and this flag is it was in pristine condition, having even gone through those horrible situations because it was sewed between the blankets. And so the flag that you see that's gone up there is a very nice looking flag compared to the one in Masters of the Air that was dirty and crumpled. That really resonated with me. But anyway, he scrambled out. And this was not the first flag they saw. I don't know if George remembers, the first flag was in the city of Moosburg over City Hall. That one was run up the flagpole earlier. And they didn't know what kind of flag it was at first until it unfurled about 3/4 way up the flag. And then they saw the American flag and they started to cheer, and they were quite happy about that. And it wasn't until 2 o'clock in the afternoon that this flag went up later. And he scrambled up to the top. He ripped down the Nazi flag, and he put Old Glory up. And I think that was one of the most emotional moments for all of those men, seeing their flag again. And he brought the Nazi flag home. I forget where that is now. Maybe the Air Force Academy has it. I'm not sure. I can't remember. But yeah, it was very emotional, and everything changed when that flag went up.
George, you remember seeing this flag?
I saw the flag. The
Mhm.
tanks came in and the infantry came in and the flag went up.
It was an emotional moment. What did you do, George, when you saw your flag go up?
Well, there was sort of happiness. We were in bad shape
Yeah.
physically and for a number of reasons. So it was so good to see these guys and know that two things were going to happen. One, our families would know that we're alive and everything. You got to remember
Hmm.
that when we were shut down, same thing today. My mother and father got a notification your son is
Okay.
missing in action. If we hear more, we'll let you know. They never heard more for months and months. And this is from early February 45 until our liberation. So
Mhm.
fortunately, one of our crew members could speak two other languages. So they took him out to be a translator to help, and he was able to get a telegram out to all of our crew, whether they were the mothers and fathers or wives, to let them all know we were alive, and sufficiently well enough to be coming home. So it was very dramatic in that sense. But other
Mhm.
than that, it was just a relief that what we had gone through was now over.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that
Yeah.
great sense of relief. Yeah, and when they
Yeah.
came in and liberated, I was telling Glenn and Nancy, there were two, I don't know if you knew them, McCracken POWs. There were two men named McCracken, and both of their brothers came in with the Third Army and liberated their own brothers. There was a father that liberated a son. There was a
Wow.
son that liberated a father. Those are some of the more interesting stories that you don't always hear about. But I've written up the McCracken brothers story. But and then all four of them got together decades after the war, and they met each other and went out to dinner.
And
So
Marilyn, this last photo we're going to show here is just such a beautifully, I don't know, portrayed. It's just framed so well. What's going on here? Who's in this picture?
there's Zimmelite on the left. He had come up. He had to surrender the camp. Um, that's Major Zimmelite on the left, and he's surrendering the camp to Lieutenant Colonel James Lan, who was the commander of the 47th Tank Battalion, 14th Armored Division.
Yeah.
On the right is RAF Group Captain and Senior Allied Officer Willett. And this picture was actually taken by a POW who had hidden a camera in a loaf of bread.
Wow.
And the reason all these cameras were around, that was a clandestine camera I think he had. But as these tanks came through different towns, they had liberated, I think it was two, at least one camera, German camera factory, and just went in and took a lot of cameras. And they passed them out when they got to Moosburg. And that's why you see a lot of liberation pictures, they took of each other and what the conditions were and that kind of thing.
The star of that photo is the gun.
Yeah, oh yeah. It speaks volumes, doesn't it? And
Yes,
there
it
was a
does.
picture, we don't have it. I think I sent it to you, Glenn. Clark is on, after liberation, he's riding on a tank and he's sitting in front next to that gun. On the other side is Stillman was a prisoner of war with him, a really good friend of his for life. And when Clark later became superintendent of the Air Force Academy, he made Stillman his commandant of cadets. And so there's pictures. They were together for a long time. But I always
We,
think of that when I see them on that camp,
yeah.
the tank on Liberation Day.
There's so many of these photos we could
Oh,
show. Just don't have the time. I love this one. Again, the cannon is interesting, but the expression on these men's faces, it
oh
just,
yeah. He's
uh,
stern. He's no nonsense. And Zimmelite had prepared a formal surrender, and he got partway through it, and they would have none of it. They
yeah,
they stopped him. They said, "Get over there with the rest of the guys." They disarmed all the Germans in the camp and said, "Get over there with them. Just stand with them." And eventually, they were all taken away.
okay, great. Okay, so we're going to jump now to the next story here. We're doing pretty good on time,
Good.
and that's the liberation of Stalag Luft 1. And Nancy is going to walk us through a very different story that occurred. And a lot of what happened, Nancy, is, as you've explained to me, happens again because of this man, Hub Zemke.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, no, this is definitely the chaos that Marilyn and George have described down at Moosburg and what they all went through, completely different. You get way up in Barth, it was isolated. It was really out of the it was not under the attention so much of the Nazis as were the other camps. They were well aware the marches were happening. By December, January, even before Stalag Luft 3 evacuates, the enlisted camps are evacuating. Some started several months earlier, when they were more in the central part of Poland. So it's well known. So Zemke comes in the third week of December. And as I mentioned, just by virtue of his personality and his kind of his life philosophy, which descends from being a boxer as a kid, being picked on because he was German. And this is post-World War I in America. And he was known as being smart, never giving an inch. And, you know, when you get punched, you punch back harder. Never, ever, his phrase was, don't ever, ever give up the initiative. Always keep it, always press forward. And he used that philosophy as a fighter pilot, as a fighter group commander, and as a senior Allied officer at Stalag Luft 1. So when he comes in, North Compound 1 becomes the nerve center for what is known as Wing X, Provisional Wing X. There was some mention of this in Stalag Luft 3, like in The Great Escape, not so much with Masters of the Air, because, you know, for whatever reason, they didn't highlight it. But it was, in essence, the military command that the Allied officers maintained in the camps. So the Germans were in charge of the camps, if you will, but internal operations were run by the Allied officers at both camps. North 1 had, as I mentioned, a lot of fighter pilots. It also had a lot of bomber pilots. And it had, does anybody know the name Ross Greening? Does that ring a bell? Yeah, Marilyn does. I'm not sure how many other will. He was a B-25 pilot, flew with Doolittle's Raiders, evaded in China for 4 months after the raid on Japan in April of 42, gets back to the United States. Doolittle takes some of his pilots and navigators and bombardiers, brings them into the 12th Air Force. He's taken over in North Africa. Ross Greening ends up a squadron commander in North Africa, promptly gets shot down over Italy, lands with a broken leg on Mount Vesuvius, is a prisoner of the Italians, escapes when Italy starts to falter and surrender. He goes with the partisans for a number of months, I think 6 or 8 months, ends up captured by the Germans, ends up in Stalag Luft 1. He is the senior officer in North Compound 1. He is my dad's boss, in essence, militarily. My dad is a barracks commander. There are 9 barracks in North 1. The barracks commanders are all basically bomber pilots, and they are led by Ross Greening. And then the senior commander of the whole camp is Hub Zemke. He sets the tone. He is running this like a military group, squadrons, and everybody underneath that is basically like the air crew or the ground crew. The one thing they do, though, that upsets the POWs, as they make all the right plans to take control of the camp, not allow it to be force-marched, he's negotiating with the Germans. Remember, he knows German, and he knows that they do not want to surrender or be captured by the Russians. That is the hand he plays. He plays it from day one, and he plays it brilliantly. The POWs don't know this, other than the barracks commanders and his immediate commanders of each of the compounds. So there's a lot of restlessness, wondering what is he doing. There's some resentment, but that plays to their advantage in the end. As my dad said, a lot of the men really resented Zemke. They just thought he was somewhat of a narcissistic smartass, but they didn't realize till the end what he was really up to, and that it in fact saved their lives. So he establishes a really good working relationship with the camp commanders, with the guards. And over time, he just keeps dropping if you leave the camp and don't kill us and pick a fight, we'll let you go towards the Brit and American lines. That's what they want.
And let's just look at the geography again. I put this map in here just to help everybody understand. The Russians are coming from obviously the Soviet Union, Russia, and they're coming west, right in here.
Correct. Yep.
And as they come further west, the 6 and 4 are marched. Those are the enlisted camps, and they're marched further west. 3 is evacuated, as we said, on the Long March or the Great March, ends up at 7A. So the whole objective was to keep these prisoners away from the Russians. Luft 1 here, right, where your father is.
Right. So a lot of about I can't remember the number. I want to say about 1,000 of the enlisted guys from 4 ended up being coming into Stalag Luft 1 late January, maybe the first few days of February. Others ended up marching further southwest. A lot of especially the enlisted camps, they broke up into subgroups. So it's not like 5,000 guys marched and ended up in the same place. It wasn't that at all. It was just the opposite. They broke up into groups. And I remember my dad saying that when the men literally came into the camp, they had been locked in boxcars for 8 days, very little food or water, dumped off at the Barth train station, and then marched into the camp. And the camp was overcrowded. They had very little food. By then, Stalag Luft 1 had hardly any food. It was, if you look again, consider the location, the country of Germany is just being strafed and bombed, especially marshalling yards where all the trains switch. So Red Cross packages were not getting there. Food in general was very hard to come by. Very little sanitation. And here now get dumped in on them another 1,000 really ragtag, sick, dehydrated, starving prisoners. They had to go somewhere, and they were simply distributed among the camp barracks to the degree they could. It was really a mess, and was very overcrowded. But they weren't forced marched. That's the only good news.
And let's look at this fascinating map. And the reason it's fascinating is the author of this map, who was?
My dad loved doing maps. He was one of the senior guys in the escape committee in North Compound 1, again, under Ross Greening and Zemke. And so he would, with cigarettes, bribe the guards, get maps, copy them. I'm sure they did it in Luft 3 as well. It was one of the ways they entertained themselves. And this actually, one of the purposes of a map like this was exactly what happened. When they are able to get out, as they do in several months later, when the Russians come, they want to go to the British and American lines. They do not want to go east with the Russians, although the Russians wanted them to go east. And they used maps like this to do that. So if you see up in the upper right, it's Rostock. Rostock is southwest of Barth. So if you take your little pointer up into that corner, that is Barth. It's right off the map. One road goes down to Rostock, And then at the point in April when everything's falling apart and the Russians are coming, the British are right there. They are in Wismar. The Americans are south of there. So Montgomery's troops, for those who know the movement of the Army front lines in the final weeks of the war, Montgomery and the Brits were to the north. The Americans were central and south. And so Zemke organized 3 advance teams. One who had Russian speakers, went east to try and meet up with the Russians. The second went to Wismar and tried to meet up with Montgomery and his troops. And then a third team went south. They weren't quite sure where the line was, but they did all connect up within several days with the Americans, the Brits, and the Russians. The whole goal was to say, hey, we're all up here. Come get us. The Russians were holding first the Germans were using the POWs as pawns, and now the Russians were holding Stalag Luft 1 and its POWs as pawns. For those not aware, Yalta, which had occurred between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in February, an agreement was reached, much to Churchill's dismay. Roosevelt went along with Stalin and said, all Russians must be repatriated to the Soviet Union. Most of the Russians being held in the West did not want to be repatriated. And sadly, the Americans at Stalag Luft 1 were the pawns in this whole unfolding event. There was one unit, I actually found, there was a General Vlasov who had formed 2 anti-communist divisions, infantry divisions, under the Nazis and fought the Russians. The Soviet Union would not release the prisoners at Barth until that General Vlasov and his 2 anti-communist divisions were returned to Russia. Eisenhower agreed very reluctantly because it was how he was going to get the 9,000 Americans and some, Brits out of Barth. So that when that was agreed to.
Let me ask a question, Nancy. The Russians then are the ones who appear first at Stalag Luft 1.
We sort of, so thank you. We got ahead. I went to Moosburg. So on April 29th, Moosburg, the same day that Moosburg is liberated by Patton's Third Army, is the day that Zemke has an agreement from the German guards at 2200 hours that evening. The lights in the camp go off. There were no interior lights at night. This was the exterior lights. Guards open the gate to Stalag Luft 1. Off they go. They head west, taking only small arms. They left all other guns and arms, ammunition in the camp by agreement with Zemke. The POWs wake up the next morning, and there in the towers are Americans. They had no idea. I learned as I grew up that my father was part of that senior command because he was North 1 that took over the camp. It was peaceful, so there were no shots fired. But then the Russians start coming in, and they're awful.
Mongolians.
They're drunk. They're crazy. It is. They killed wantonly in town. They raped. Some of the POWs wander out of camp. In the first few days, they're told don't go, but they do. The camp is unlocked. The Russians are pulling down the barbed wire and saying, "Come join us. Come kill and rape Germans. Come plunder." And there's many, many stories of. The Russians stole more than the Germans ever did from the Americans. And then if an American commented that they famously, there was an old German man with boots, and an ex-POW comments, I like those boots. I can't wait to get a pair like them. What do you think the Russian guy did? He shoots the German dead, pulls the boots off the guy, and gives them to the American. It was there were suicides of mothers and children. I mean, it was awful.
And the POWs then, what does Zemke do to arrange to evacuate the POWs?
Well, he has sent out those advance teams. Eisenhower knows what's going on. He knows the score. Montgomery has sent for the Brits to come in. The goal is, the only way they're going to get out is by air evacuation. That requires Soviet permission. The Russians do everything they can to drag their feet, waiting for Eisenhower to say, yep, we're going to send this general and his divisions and everyone else back. That's the payment to get the POWs out. It took 2 weeks. Soviets made everybody sign 2 different documents. The paperwork was ridiculous. Eventually, Eisenhower just has had enough. May 11th, he orders the 91st, goes up to Bassingbourn, 91st Bomb Group, B-17s, and there were a lot of 91st Bomb Group POWs in the camp, which was really the cool part. You get their stories of seeing their planes and their crews come in, land at this little airfield, the Barth Airfield.
Which is portrayed on the right here.
Yep, there are your pictures. Those are the B-17s. You'll see them come in. They literally land, taxi in groups of 30 to 32. These guys don't have possessions. They don't weigh a lot. They load. In under 5 minutes, each plane lands, taxis, loads with POWs, takes off, and heads to France to Camp Lucky Strike. They do this for 3 days and get close to 9,000 guys out. You have to ask what happened to the other several hundred. There were over 9,000 in the camp. Some just took to the road and headed to the front lines. A handful, they estimate 200 to 300, did follow the Russians, who convinced them they could get out through Odessa.
Yes.
A few did, but most of the guys, and this haunted my father the rest of his life. He always thought there were 200 to 300 alive in camp at Liberation who followed the Russians and who were never heard from again. Yeah. And the POWs, by and large, did not want to follow the Russians. They wanted to go, obviously, to the American or British lines. But it did take close to 3 days of round-the-clock B-17s landing, loading, taking off. My dad was one of the last guys out. Zemke was the last man out. And I have a great quote of his that says, I will never forget the last view of what was Stalag Luft 1, the gate wide, the weather-beaten wood buildings gaunt and silent, no Kriegies pounding round the inner boundary wire. Of all my wartime haunts, it is the one I never wish to see again. He saved those guys, and it became understood pretty quickly what happened. But the other piece of the liberation that is not widely known, there was an industrial complex. You pointed out, and you showed the picture of the Barth airfield. Next to the airfield was this industrial complex. It housed both a chemical warfare station and an small aircraft assembly plant. Those used slave labor, mostly Jewish. It was a subcamp of major concentration camps. My father was one of the team. There were a couple of Brits and Americans and a Russian, because a Russian had to go along with everything, who went and found this camp. There was only several hundred left, dying, mostly Jewish slave laborers. The others had been force marched out, according to those who survived, only a few weeks earlier. It devastating. It was basically it was a slave, it was a death camp. They were just worked to death. There were bodies there. It was just horrible conditions, and a couple hundred dying, and most of them did die. They were too far gone to save.
Okay, so I took the shared or the PowerPoint down because I wanted to Sean check on questions from the audience and check the chat. And Sean, there's a Kim W in the chat who posted that her father, First Lieutenant Orville Mickelson, was at Stalag Luft 3. He was with the 93rd Bomb Group, co-pilot of a B-24, shot down in April of 43. 836 days in captivity, including the Long March. Could we find Kim? I think here, I'm going to ask her to unmute. See, Kim, are you still there? Could you unmute, please?
Found her, asked her to unmute. She doesn't have her video on. But it doesn't seem like she is at her computer. Kim, if you can get to the unmute.
Okay. I just thought, given here's another daughter of a POW who was in Luft 3. Does that name Orville Mickelson mean anything to you, Marilyn? A name you ran across in your research?
Not right offhand. I hear from a lot of the sons and daughters of POWs. I could have heard of that name, but there's been so many of them. They're all melded in together now.
Yeah.
Sounds a little familiar to me. I don't know. Maybe she gets my newsletter.
Saw a few other questions in the chat room popping up.
Yeah, Sean. First of all, anybody like to ask a question in person? If not, Sean, what questions should we address from the chat?
I see the Kim message says she's not able to unmute. Sorry about that, Kim, but thank you for putting the information into the chat. Unmuted Mary Klepper. Mary, you had a question and a story?
I didn't have a question. This was amazing. Thank you, ladies. And I'm so thankful that your fathers shared what they did so that we know. It's very important. One thing that's very interesting is Monday I came across an article and then all of a sudden, Todd announces that this is our topic for Thursday. And it was this man named Roddy Edmonds, and he came in toward the end of the war, and they got captured at the Battle of the Bulge. And at first he was taken to Stalag 9A, I think it was, or 9B. And then after about a month, he and about 1,200 men, 1,300 men, they were moved to 9A or B, whichever one is opposite. And anyway, the first night they were there, they heard over the intercom system that the next morning, only the Jewish soldiers are to report out for roll call.
Yep, that happened.
And yeah, and Roddy Edmonds is a master sergeant, and now that he's with this smaller group, he's now the highest ranking official. And he says, look, he said, the Geneva Convention says we give our name, our rank, and our serial number. That's it. We all fall out tomorrow. And so they all fell out, and then the German got in his face and he goes, there's no way you're all Jews. And he said, we are all Jews here. And he said, you give me the Jews or I'll shoot you. And he goes, then you shoot all of us and you'll be arrested when the war is over. Because it was right at the end, and they want that final solution. They're trying to kill as many as possible. And he gave up and he said, never mind. And it turns out he saved like 200 Jewish soldiers, including the 19-year-old right next to him, who was still alive about 10 years ago. And that's Roddy Edmonds, was from Knoxville, Tennessee. He only lived to be 66, which is sad. But he was the very first American soldier to be named the righteous among the nations for Yad Vashem.
Yeah. I'm familiar with that story. A lot of the camps.
Sorry, we're getting. Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
Hello. Oh, sorry to interrupt. We're getting. I asked Kim to unmute, but once she unmuted, we got a lot of microphone feedback from Kim. Hold on one sec. Go ahead. Continue.
Yeah. I'm glad you've heard of that story. I was blown away by it. It's amazing.
Well, at Luft 1, they did take some of the Jews, but they kept them in within the compounds, but they put them in a barracks. It was ridiculous. There was absolutely no repercussion. There was no mistreatment, and the same thing basically occurred. That was not isolated, but in that case, because of the circumstance, they really did risk all being shot. Whereas within again, because of Zemke and the military structure, the Germans really were afraid of him. They knew he wielded power, and they respected him.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a beautiful story.
Because I was looking it up because at Roddy Edmonds, he was only born in 1919, so he's not very old. He's a master sergeant. He's not a colonel or anything. I mean, I saving 200 people. He got a Congressional Gold Medal posthumously when his son figured it all out. You save 200 people, maybe a little Medal of Honor taken it right there. I mean, that's a miracle. And with all the Jews to have survived and the witness statements there, it's amazing. The reading that story was absolutely amazing. So, but thank you very much for sharing your dad's story. It's incredible.
I've asked George to unmute because George looked like he wanted to say something. And George,
what they're talking about, everybody ought to read this book, Soldiers and Slaves. Talking about those POWs who were Jewish, who were taken out and made slave laborers. You can get it at Amazon or anyway. It's a fascinating book. Written by a reporter who works for New York Times, Roger Cohn. It came out about 10 years ago, but it talks about what you're talking about, what happened. It's called Soldiers and Slaves, POWs during the Second World War. So I do recommend it highly.
As well.
And George, what's interesting about your story is you were born Jewish and you had an H on your dog tag, shot down. And as I recall your story, you never ran into any problems with being Jewish.
I was, I guess, the lucky one, Glenn. Matter of fact, our crew would talk about it. The assumption with George, should you get rid of your dog tags? Of course, in those days, every dog tag had your religion on it. A P for Protestant, C for Catholic, H for Jews. And we talked about it in our Quonset huts before our missions. And the assumption, you had two sides to that. One, you could get rid of the dog tag, but there's a good chance then the Germans would kill you as a spy or keep them and see what would happen. And I guess I was the lucky one, even though shot down, wounded, wound up for a day in a German hospital, treated there. And through all the months that I was a POW, I never had a problem being Jewish. So I was, I guess, one of the lucky ones. But the stories I've read, including that book and others, some horrible stories to young men, really, under the German rule.
Yeah. Thank you, George. Sean, anyone else that has their hand up? We do have a conclusion to this if we can get to it, but
one question actually from YouTube. Gentleman asked, at Stalag 7B, how many SS troops were stationed there?
7A, I think he means, right?
Okay, 7A. Yeah, it says 7B, but if it's 7A, how many SS troops were stationed there?
Marilyn?
I have no idea.
No idea.
It would be hard to say because at that time there were SS scattered all around from Nuremberg on up.
Yeah.
What units they were with, it's hard to say who ended up at 7A. So I think that'd be hard to answer.
And one of the points that both Marilyn and Nancy impressed on me in our discussions leading up to this is the chaos that was present. There was no structure. There was, everybody running around trying to survive. And these SS men, many of them, I think, by this time of the war, were just kids who, didn't know what to do themselves. So,
yeah. There were SS, I don't know if George remembers St. Castle's Catholic Church right next to it, the twin steeples there, where there was a Nazi flag, and it was shot out. I thought that would show it in Masters of the Air. It was an ancient 8th century church, and that was one of the last things. I don't know if George saw that when there were snipers there, snipers in a cheese factory, and up there they're all over. And there was a big Nazi flag up there as well. But
So if the audience would hold in here just for another minute, I'm going to run through, Nancy and Marilyn, the last few slides that we have, because we have reached the witching hour, if you will. But I love the way we end this, and the work that Nancy and Marilyn put into this is, and I don't want to um, uh, shorten this up too much. But again, here's that picture I think you were talking about at Moosburg, right?
Mhm.
And there's again lots and lots of these pictures of the men celebrating. George, we couldn't find you in this crowd. We
There's a
looked.
tank under there.
Yeah. There's a tank under there. And of course, Patton shows up, right? Uh,
Mhm.
and Nancy mentioned that the evacuation by of Barth and Stalag Luft 1, the 91st Bomb Group, took them into Camp Lucky Strike. And I found this map. These are the various camps set up for the POWs to be marshaled in, to be deloused. I have a picture of one being deloused by DDT, which is just
It's common.
Yeah.
hard to know. Lucky Strike up here was where the Air Force POWs were taken. And just a couple of shots here. This is somebody being deloused. George, were you deloused? You were. Okay. We'll ask you for that experience later. Just a shot of the camp. And this picture, I just love the tall fella in the middle or there with the great smile on his face is Lieutenant Colonel Clark.
Last one to leave the camp for the
Last
Americans too.
And I just love that picture. Just love that.
I
I
do
mean,
too.
you imagine the joy that was on his face, as I imagine, George, you had lots of joy too when uh and then of course they're put on ships and then the ride home. And I think this is another great picture that Nancy and Marilyn shared with me. And what a great joy it must have been to see the Statue of Liberty after all those days, years, months in the prisoner of war camp. And this is the last thing I wanted to get to, and I thought it was kind of important, which is why I'm rushing to it. After the war, these men get together in reunions. Some of them did, not all of them. This is a great picture of the the Moosburg men in their first reunion. Nancy, Maryland, this was 1946, and we see your father just beaming here, right?
Mhm. There's
And
Clark.
Clark beaming here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, what a what a feeling it must have been to have known you lived through that experience and the bond that these men had afterwards.
They were friends for life. General Clark later said those are the closest friends he's ever had in his whole military career are these men.
Yeah.
And he always said, you know, you didn't survive this. He has a nice, I won't have time to read it. He has a nice statement that he made about how unique these prisoners of war were. I can send it to you and you could post it maybe.
Yeah,
But
please do.
they had the reunions for many years. The other, I don't know if I sent you, there was one other picture. It was at Wright Pat Air Force Base in the fireside room where my wedding reception was. And my dad in that picture standing right where my cake was.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
And Nancy
Good time.
and Marilyn, Nancy, I kind of remember one story you told me what it was like growing up as a daughter of someone who had been a POW in the war for so long. What sort of habits, what sort of behaviors they demonstrated as a result of their experience.
My dad did not do any POW related reunions. He did keep in touch with several of the 100th Bomb Group guys, his crew, Rosie, who was a very good friend. But I would get stories, and really only as I aged, and you know, obviously I'm old now, got white hair, but did I really put all the pieces together? And the lessons, you look back and it's like all of a sudden the light bulbs are on. He told all kinds of stories about what it was like to be a Doolittle Raider, to fly B-25s. And he mentioned, but I never pursued it as a child, knowing that he spent over a year with Ross Greening, one of the B-25 Doolittle Raiders. He knew all about it. And I didn't push far enough, but there are several things I really learned. And I've talked to others as they discover their father's stories, often after he's passed. And the first thing with my dad, my kids, if they were listening to this now, they would agree. You never and ever could say to my father, "I'm bored." If you said, "I'm bored," you would get you have no idea what boredom is until you have been locked up and imprisoned. There is never an excuse to say you're bored, to have nothing to do. Be grateful for what you have. Don't focus on what you don't have. And of course, a POW could make something from nothing. What came out of those camps is astonishing. Yeah. From making radios to Stalag Luft, famously one of the artifacts that is at the National World War II Museum, just saw it a week and a half ago, is a violin, a beautiful violin made from scraps in a POW camp, and it plays beautifully. I learned you were never allowed to feel sorry for yourself. There was always someone worse off than you. So my dad said Stalag Luft was the Cadillac of camps, because he looks at what Marilyn's father went through and all the men who were force marched. And he had none of that. He said, "I was only starved. I had lice, I had bed bugs. That was fleas, but I was never force marched, and I could recover." He looked at what the other men went through in the German camps that were worse, and especially all the POWs under the Japanese had it far worse than anyone in Germany had it. So it was always be grateful for what you have, not for what you don't have, and always be aware that someone has it way worse than you do. And that's been a really valuable thing in life, to look at. And obviously, freedom is not free. We all learn that, I think, appreciate it, and don't ever take it for granted. But there's one fun lesson, and then I'll stop. When I learned to drive, so I'm 15, 16 years old, and he's teaching me to drive, my pilot father, one of the first lessons he taught me was to always watch out for your wingmen, which basically means when you're driving a car or flying an airplane, your eye is not fixed forward. It's forward to the left, forward to the right. You're always moving, and you have to be aware of your surroundings, which for a pilot, flying formation, those B-17s were literally inches apart. It's astonishing more of them didn't crash and explode just from midair collisions. There were some. And my dad did that for many, many hours in formation in combat. And you learn to always, always watch for your wingman. That was one of my driving lessons. I taught my girls that too. So you learn a lot from your father.
Any similar comments as we close here?
My father fared pretty well after the war. I do remember that we were never to waste food. He hated to stand in long lines. Lucky Strike had long lines. The military had long lines, and he got very impatient if he had to stand in a long line. We had to turn out lights if we weren't using them. He remembered all the deprivation that he had, and I think that stuck with him for a long time. I remember he missed candy in the camp, and I have memories of him going to the PX. He was a career Air Force officer, and he'd come home with big bags of gumdrops and donuts and things. And of course, donuts were given out by the Red Cross in 7A when they came in after the war. Maybe it was that. He loved big band music, and they did hear a lot of big band members were shot down and prisoners of war in the camp. And he was surrounded with that music and taught my sister and I to dance. We would stand on his feet, and he would teach us how to dance. He loved to dance. When he was transferred to another state, in all his transfers, I remember him it was important for him to take us to whatever that state had to offer. whatever. I think he felt that he could have been so easily deprived of ever seeing anything like that in his own country, that I think that that was important to him as well. And I do remember that even he was a bombardier, but they knew how to fly those planes as well. And he would drive with he would always drove using 2 feet when he didn't have a clutch anymore. He never got past that. That was going back to the B-24 days.
Well, listen, we're well past our finishing time. Let me thank Marilyn and Nancy. It's been a great pleasure to have you on tonight. It was lots of fun to work with you this past couple of weeks to put this together. We didn't get to a third of some of the material we had, and I want to thank you very, very much. Last person I want to recognize is George, but before I recognize George Rubin, Sean, anything else that we need to address?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. George,
Yeah, I'm here.
you are
So,
our
well,
hero tonight.
just
You
my
were there.
summation to
You
what
survived.
every-
Thank you.
to
Go ahead.
my summation to what everybody has said. When I had some great times at Camp Lucky Strike, by the way. Wonderful. I started out at 165 pounds. I was down to less than 140 when I was at Lucky Strike, and had plenty of eggnogs to put the weight on, and came home on one of those Liberty ships called Marine Robin, with thousands of other GIs, mostly POWs, coming home. And we were told, forget the war, go back with your life, and found that very difficult as time went on, because the amount of what I went through would bubble to the surface. And till I went to the VA hospital to find out why I was having the nightmares and the night terrors and everything else, I had no idea that what we went through, both as a crew, both flying and as a POW, really affects your whole life. And I learned that out. And what I come away with is I've been very, very lucky. Lucky that we had a wonderful pilot who got us down with 250, 280 holes and 2 engines out in that B-17 and landed it. Lucky also that we were to be taken out to be executed, and a German officer stopped it. Lucky that I survived through prison camp to come back. And so I'm thankful for being able to relate this to people of what war does to an 18-year-old, and have we learned? And that's what bothers me, that we constantly have to go back to war to fight for things that, when we look back on it, wonder what did it all mean? So I leave that with you tonight.
Thank you, George. Thank you so very much. And we're really pleased that you made it on tonight, and we're part of the program. And thank you for surviving. Thank you for continuing telling the story. Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Nancy, to all our guests. Colin, I kept seeing you there. I kept wanting to get to you to ask you a couple questions, and just never got the chance. My apologies, my friend, and we'll be seeing you in the future, I'm sure. Sean, thank you.
Thank you all, everybody. Hope you have a great weekend. We'll see you Monday night for the Scuttlebutt. Have a great weekend.